what essentially is given purview to municipalities, something that they are empowered that was not in place prior to 1995, was the ability of a municipality to set a specific dollar figure as a minimum tax on a piece of property, regardless of the assessed value of the property. And that has created a problem. That has created a distortion in our system. If the, Madam Chair, you have the amendment now and I could read it into the record?
Yep. Thank you so much.
So, Madam Chair, at this time I would like to read the following into the record. I move to amend that Bill 21, the Modernized Municipal Government Act, be amended in Section 53 by striking out proposed Section 357.1 and substituting the following. 357.1 sub 1, the tax rate to be imposed by a municipality on residential property or on any other subclass of residential property must be greater than 0. And sub 2, notwithstanding anything to the contrary in this division, a tax rate imposed by a municipality pursuant to Section 357 must not result in a property tax on an assessable property which exceeds 2.5% of the assessed value of that property. So, Madam Chair, what does all that mean? What is the purpose of this amendment? Well, in Alberta, we have a fairly significant number of municipalities, they're mostly small municipalities, that have exercised the power that is given to them within Section 357 to allow for the levying of a minimum tax. In other words, a departure from the normal methodology for calculating taxation on property. Now, I'm going to quote from the Alberta Municipal Guide to Taxation, or Municipal Property Taxation and Assessment in Alberta. And on page 28 it states, under the Municipal Government Act, municipalities are responsible for collecting taxes for municipal and educational purposes. Property taxes are levied based on the value of the property as determined from the property assessment process. Property taxes are not a fee for service, but a way of distributing the cost for local government services and programs fairly throughout a municipality. And Madam Chair, that word fairly is the word that is at the crux of this. Currently, a large number of municipalities charge a minimum tax on property. And in some cases, that minimum tax is a relatively nominal $50 or $100. But in some cases, the minimum tax that is charged is considerably higher. In over 60 Alberta municipalities, the amount of minimum tax that there is a minimum tax, and the amount charged sometimes ranges to $800, $900, $1,000, and in some cases, the minimum tax, in fact, is more than the actual assessed value of the property. This creates a significant distortion. It creates a distortion really in two directions. The first distortion it creates is obviously the people that own these relatively lower assessed value properties have a situation where they're paying a tax bill, in fact, that is greater than the assessed value of the property. Well, you can imagine that those properties then become very difficult to keep, you know, if you're having to pay more than the assessed value year after year after year. Furthermore, it becomes difficult in small rural villages for there to be economic development and housing to be developed, because in many cases, more modest homes that would stand on these properties, more modest homes that would be taxed at a rate that should be considerably lower, are in fact subject to minimum tax. And the minimum tax is used by the municipality to raise a certain amount of funds, and by doing so, they are allowed to lower the overall mill rate, and that benefits properties of greater value, of greater assessed value. And so it's, in a way, a little bit of what I call a reverse Robin Hood. You're actually taking from the poor and providing a benefit to the rich. Now, that certainly is contrary to most NDP philosophy, I believe. And so while for the last 20 years, while there's been a different government in place, this was on the books, certainly I would have expected that now that there's an NDP government, and an NDP government that is committed to wealth redistribution in many different forms, that this would be a very logical place where an NDP government could step in and correct a problem with an inequity within our property taxation system, whereby under Section 357, municipalities are permitted to charge a minimum tax. Minimum tax is punitive. Minimum tax is fundamentally unfair, and it is fundamentally unfair to the most vulnerable within our communities. And when I look at the list of communities that charge a minimum tax is charged in some of our smaller communities that are already perhaps struggling with being able to remain viable, and yet they're not charging the taxation that should be charged on some of the higher value properties. The mill rate is in fact being subsidized by lower valued properties. In one village in particular in my constituency, some 47% of the properties within that village are actually charged the minimum tax. If you multiply the assessed value by the mill rate that should be getting charged, they should have a much lower tax bill, but in fact they are charged a much higher rate because they are charged a minimum tax that is higher than what they should be paying, and what it does effectively is subsidizes those owners of properties of greater value. This is an inequity. This is a fundamentally unfair situation, and it is a fundamentally unfair departure from what I just read from the Guide to Municipal Taxation and Assessment in the Taxation Guide. Taxation is supposed to be based on the value of the property. And in most Alberta municipalities, that indeed is what happens. But in a percentage of Alberta municipalities, that is not what happens, and Section 357 of the current Municipal Government Act allows for this. This is, in my view, an unfair distortion of our taxation system. And it is unfair, as I've said before, for Albertans that are disadvantaged, for Albertans that are vulnerable, and it creates a distortion that, in my view, also affects the ability of small rural communities to develop, because there's this anchor on development, especially an anchor on development of lower value properties. And so, Madam Chair, while I know it's not habit for the government to approve opposition amendments, we did see it happen this afternoon, and we were very encouraged by that. This is an amendment that, in my view, brings a measure of fairness to a taxation system, and it creates, or it corrects rather, an inequity that has been present in the Municipal Government Act for the last 20 years. And I think that it's a measure of fairness, and I think it's something that this government can demonstrate that it understands the need for fairness. Now, I would have liked to have been able to completely eliminate minimum tax entirely. On advice from Parliamentary Council, it was found that we couldn't do that, so that's why I have suggested, and it is somewhat arbitrary, the 2.5% cap on the minimum tax. That means at that level, it would take 40 years of paying that minimum tax until you have paid the assessed value of the property, unlike the current situation where in some situations you actually pay more than the assessed value of the property in minimum tax. And you can imagine that that creates significant distortions in the real estate market in those communities. So, Madam Chair, I would encourage all members of the Assembly to take a look at this amendment. I would ask for their support in voting for this amendment, because I do think it corrects a very basic inequity in the current legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Any other members wishing to